It was January 29th, 2020. A man on a motorbike rides down a narrow dirt path in the quiet countryside of Vietnam. The air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of tilled earth, distant wood smoke. There's no reason for anyone to think this night is different. But what happens next will leave for people dead and trigger one of the largest manhunts in the country's history. A couple minutes later, he arrives at his destination. He swings his leg off the motorbike, his sandals crunching against the gritty earth. Up ahead, the sounds of laughter, cheers, and the unmistakable clink of coins and rustle of bills reach his ears. Each laugh fans the flames burning inside him, each cheer a blow to his pride. His hands curl into fists, knuckles white as the memories crash over him. The sting of defeat, the humiliation of their smug faces, the way they laughed when he lost it all. Then from beneath his jacket he pulls out something cold, heavy, and deadly. Opening the door slowly, he stops just outside the entrance, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. This place, this room, he's been here before. He knows the stale smell of sweat and cigarettes, the faces lit with greedy anticipation. He's even sat at that table clutching the crumpled up dollar bills and chasing the hope of winning big. But in his case, his hope had turned to humiliation. They laughed when he lost, they sneered when he walked away empty-handed. But tonight, he's not the man who left in shame. Tonight, he's come for payback. The door creaks open wider and heads start to turn toward him. One by one, they freeze. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, he prepares to do exactly what he came here. Sometime in early 2020, a 33-year-old man named Le Quoc Tuan steps through a narrow doorway hidden behind an unassuming storefront in the heart of Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He's heard whispers about this place, a gambling den where fortunes are won and lost in the span of a heartbeat. Entering the makeshift den, the air is thick with cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of voices mingles with the sharp clink of coins striking porcelain. The most popular game here is called Shak Zir, or loosely translated as Shake the Plate. Tuan watches closely as a dealer explains the rules for coins, each with a red side and a white side are shaken beneath the plate. The goal is simple: place your bet on whether the coins will show more reds or more whites. It sounds straightforward, but almost deceptively straightforward. Arriving at the table, Tuan starts cautiously placing a small bet. After a few shakes, the dealer lifts the plate to reveal the coins to red to white. He wins to the dealer, then sweeps a few crumpled bills into his direction. It's not much, but it's enough to stir something inside him. A spark of hope, a thrill that tingles at the edges of his nerves. He places another bet slightly higher this time. Another shake, another reveal, he wins again, and the rush sharpens, a whisper in the back of his mind telling him that maybe, just maybe, this is his chance. Then the pattern shifts, the dealer opens the plate and he loses. Not by much, but just enough to feel a sting. He brushes it off, convinced it was a fluke. He bets again, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table as the dealer shakes the plate. The coins clatter and settle, another when relief washes over him, mingling with excitement. Tuan places another, the bet a little higher this time after all. He has to make up for his losses, doesn't he? But soon the losses start to outnumber the wins. A tiny flutter of doubt creeps into his mind. He brushes it aside, focusing harder. Tuan convinces himself that each loss is just another step closer to a win. He can almost feel the turn of his luck hovering just out of reach. The sound of the coins under the porcelain rings in his ears like a taunt. He leans in closer, watching the dealer's every move, searching for clues that aren't there. The plate lifts, the coins flash red and white, and the outcome is revealed: another loss. As time passes, he places bet after bet, each one pushing the stakes a little higher, but with each loss the sting grows sharper and the wound cuts deeper. Gambling dens like these are pretty common in many parts of Vietnam. They operate quietly, hiding behind storefronts or concealed within older buildings. These are places that you could walk by 100 times, yet never suspect what lies beyond its doors. Of course, the law in Vietnam doesn't tolerate them. Police raids happen frequently, and those caught inside face harsh consequences. like steep fines that can wipe out any of their winnings or even time behind bars. The risk is real and the price of being caught can be steep, yet the promise of quick, easy money is a temptation that drowns out all caution. For many who enter these dens, the allure of a jackpot, the thrill of the bed, and the hope of instant fortune eclipses the fear of getting caught in these places. Hope, and desperation makes driving people to keep coming back no matter the risk. In this situation, most gamblers don't think about the risks or consider the consequences. All they see is the game and the hope of a big win. But these places are more than just for gambling. Fortunes are not the only things lost here. Sometimes people lose far more. It was January 29th, 2020. The 5th day of the Lunar New Year. The streets of Chuchi district were quieter than usual. Families gathered in their homes, the sound of laughter and conversation carried on the evening breeze. A sense of celebration and calm lingered in the air. In the rural depths of the Tanthandong commune, something similar was unfolding. Laughter filled the air, but it was punctuated by occasional bursts of anger and frustration. And on the table there was more than just hope. There was a lot of money at stake. Concealed within a dense grove of trees stood a makeshift gambling den. It wasn't much, a crude open-air shelter tucked away from prying eyes. The canopy of branches provided just enough cover to keep it hidden. Around a worn, rickety table, gamblers were engrossed in their world, their eyes fixed on the dealer's hands, their breaths shallow and their focus unyielding. Some players stood back, eyes scanning every movement for a hint of advantage. Others leaned in, closed their fingers, twitching, ready to pounce on the next opportunity. In this isolated pocket of the world, the thrill of chance consumed them. They were locked in a cycle of hope and despair, unaware that their fates were about to collide with something far more dangerous. Among the gamblers stood 33-year-old Tuan, known in the area as Tuan Ki. He had a lean frame, his posture relaxed yet controlled, and a face that gave away little. His expression was always neutral, marked by a calmness that made it hard to read what was going on in his mind. To most, he was just another player, a man quietly placing his baits, unremarkable and easy to overlook. But for those who cared to look closer, there were signs. A tightness in his jaw, a fleeting intensity in his eyes. The way his fingers tapped lightly against the table. As the afternoon dragged on, Tuan was on a losing streak and his composure began to crack. Luck had turned its back on him, and with each failed bet, the pile of crumpled bills in front of him grew smaller. By now he had lost nearly 200 million Vietnamese dong, close to $8,000. This was an entire year's worth of hard-earned wages gone in a matter of hours. Each shake of the plate felt like a cruel joke, and the clatter of the coins echoed in his mind. It was as if the game itself was mocking him, telling him that no matter how hard he tried, he would never win. When he started that day, he had likely imagined turning a modest sum into a life-changing haul. But now he watched helplessly as his hopes crumbled, the money slipping through his fingers faster than he could hold on. The gamblers around him didn't help either. Some were undoubtedly riding the wave of his misfortune, their quiet smirks and subtle note of satisfaction twisted the knife even deeper. Their wines were his losses, and the sting of their silent judgment burned hotter with every passing second. Tuan's patience wore thinner, his breath shorter. The realization struck like a blow. He was running out of money. The sensible choice would have been to walk away, to accept defeat and live to fight another day. But that option was a bitter pill he refused to swallow. The thought of leaving as a failure ignited a fire in his chest. The humiliation, the whispers, the quiet laughter, all of it threatened to consume him. He couldn't let it end like this. There had to be a way out. One more chance, one more bet to make things right. With a sharp breath, he pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he punched in the number. When his cousin Min answered, Tuan's voice was low and firm. "Min, listen to me. Go to my mother's house. There's 100 million there. I need you to bring it to me. Don't ask questions, just do it. I can't leave like this. I'm not walking away a loser. Hurry and don't tell anyone." When the call ended, the silence that followed felt oppressive. Tuan had drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back. His pride, his desperation, his simmering rage, they all merged into a singular relentless drive one way or another. He was determined to change his fate. But with every bet he edged closer to the moment when everything would finally end and violently break. A 100 million Vietnamese dong is almost $4,000. This was a huge chunk of cash, way more than most people would ever dream of betting all at once. But for Tuan, this was no longer about the money. It had become far more personal. Tuan's cousin Min finally showed up with the money, but as he took the cash and added it to his stack, the reality didn't shift. He placed bet after bet, but the losses, they kept rolling in. After a few consecutive losses, Tuan was once again running out of money. The mood around the table shifted. The friendly banter started, replaced by grumbles and sharp remarks. The tension grew. Tuan's frustration bubbled over, and he started snapping at the other gamblers. Maybe it was their smug comments or the way they laughed while he kept losing. Whatever it was, it lit a spark inside him. Then, without a word, Tuan pushed back from the table. His movements were swift, almost mechanical. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes, they blazed with something dangerous, something beyond frustration. He turned on his heel and walked out, his steps pounding with barely contained fury. Moments later, the roar of his motorbike tore through the quiet grove as he sped off into the humid afternoon. To the other gamblers, it probably looked like nothing more than the tantrum of a sore loser who couldn't handle defeat. But for Tuan, this wasn't surrender, it was a calculated retreat. As he vanished down the dusty path, something dark turned inside him. Eventually, the man who had walked away empty-handed returned, but not with more cash or another desperate bet. He came back with an AK-47 strapped to his back. Pointing the barrel of the gun towards the table, the first shot exploded into the air, and a deafening crack shattered the tense stillness of the den. The closest gambler barely had time to react before he crumpled to the ground, his chair clattering loudly as it toppled with him. In that instant, the room descended into chaos. Screams erupted sharp, and panicked players lunged in every direction, desperate to escape. A man shoved away from the table, eyes wide with terror, his feet slipping on the debris. Another gambler, fueled by blind desperation, rushed toward Tuan in a last-ditch effort to stop him. But Tuan's movements were cold and precise. He raised the AK-47 and fired again. The second shot slammed into the man, who fell mid-stride, his body hitting the ground with a lifeless thud. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the den, ripping through flesh and splintering wood, and then just as quickly as it began, the gunfire ceased. For men lay motionless, their bodies draped over the makeshift table and sprawled across the dirt floor. Two more gamblers groaned, weakly clutching their wounds, their eyes glazing over as the life ebbed from them. Tuan stepped forward and surveyed the devastation he had just unleashed. His gaze settled on one of the victims, named Min Tung, whose lifeless body was slumped over a scattered pile of cash. The sight of the money brought no hesitation. Tuan reached down, his fingers sweeping up the crumpled bills, 80 million Vietnamese dong, and stuffed them into a waiting bag. With the gun still slung across his back, he walked back towards his motorcycle, swung his leg over the seat, and kick-started the engine. Without looking back, Tuan sped off, leaving behind a scene soaked in death and blood. What he set in motion that day unleashed one of the largest manhunts Vietnam had ever seen. When 33-year-old Tuan left the den, the place had become eerily silent, save for the faint cries of the wounded and the hushed, disbelieving murmurs of survivors. For men lay dead where they had been seated moments earlier. Their lifeless bodies sprawled over the gambling table, stained with blood. Nearby, to others clutched their wounds, their faces contorted in agony, barely holding on. The survivors, frozen in shock, stood at a distance, struggling to process the horrific scene that had just unfolded. Among them, someone made the call to the police, a trembling voice on the other end of the line desperately recounting the unimaginable carnage. Meanwhile, Tuan sped away on the stolen motorbike, its engine roaring as he disappeared into the dense rural landscape cape. In his bag was more than 800 million Vietnamese dong in cash, or around $32,000. These were the blood-stained spoils of his rampage. When authorities received the call, their response was swift. Officers from multiple specialized units were quickly mobilized, racing toward the scene. Heavily armed and on high alert, they didn't know what awaited them, whether the shooter might still be nearby or if the situation could escalate further. Within minutes of their arrival, investigators began their work. They sifted through the scene, cataloging every detail. The shattered remnants of the gambling setup, discarded belongings, and bullet-riddled surfaces. Security cameras from nearby roads were reviewed, and while the footage varied in quality, one critical image stood out. A grainy capture of the shooter moments after the massacre. He was riding the stolen motorbike, his face partially obscured by a mask and cap, clad in a black jacket, blue shorts, and sandals. He seemed unremarkable, but to the officers, this was their target, an armed, dangerous fugitive capable of unthinkable violence. As the investigators delved deeper into the identity of the shooter, the footage, a chilling detail, came to light. One that sent shockwaves through the task force. This wasn't just any armed fugitive. His name was Lekuk Tuan, a former police officer. The man they were hunting had once worn the very uniform of those now chasing him. Tuan had been trained in combat armed tactics and skills that now made him an even deadlier adversary for the officers pursuing him. This wasn't just a manhunt. It was a race against someone who knew exactly how they worked, how they thought, how they moved, how they hunted. For the next few days, Tuan's whereabouts were a complete mystery. His trail seemed to have vanished almost as soon as it had appeared, leaving investigators grasping for leads and the community gripped with unease. But Tuan wasn't actually lying low or hiding. Every moment was spent calculating his next move, taking deliberate steps to outmaneuver the authorities and stay one step ahead of the tightening net around him. Reports suggest that after fleeing the scene, Tuan sought refuge at the home of an accomplice named Pham Than Tam, known better as Pham. At his house, Tuan handed over a portion of the stolen money, instructing him to pass it along to his wife. It might have been a desperate attempt to secure his family's future. Even as his own life spiraled further into chaos, yet Tuan didn't linger for too long here. Very quickly, he abandoned the stolen motorbike he had used to escape the gambling den, knowing it could lead the authorities directly to him. He then set off on foot, traveling through the dense rural paths of Gucci under the cover of darkness. Somewhere along the winding trails, Tuan came across a local couple riding a motorbike, Tran Ngokpye and his wife. At first, the encounter might have seemed harmless, a lone man walking along the roadside, but as Tuan approached, he brandished his weapon, and in an instant the couple's world was turned upside down. With cold, calculated determination to Tuan ambush them, the rifle slung threateningly over his shoulder. Paralyzed with fear, the couple had no choice but to comply. They surrendered their motorbike without resistance, helplessly watching as Tuan sped off with their vehicle before disappearing into the night. The stolen motorbike carried Tuan deeper into the countryside, but even he must have realized that his trail was becoming more obvious with every move. The couple would surely report the theft, which would only give the authorities more clues on his whereabouts. Therefore, Tuan's next move as calculated. He approached the canal in the Phu Hoa Dong commune, a secluded, shadowed stretch of water surrounded by dense vegetation. Stopping the motorbike, he tipped it into the water without hesitation. As the vehicle disappeared beneath the murky surface, Tuan plunged into the canal, himself swimming across with the rifle and stolen money in tow. Emerging on the other side dripping and weary, he pressed forward into the darkness, his thoughts likely consumed by the growing realization that time was running out. Emerging on the opposite bank, Tuan made his way to the home of another trusted ally, Vo Hong Tam. For Tuan, this stop was more than just a hiding place. It was a moment to regroup and consider his next steps while the police closed in from all sides. Tam opened the door to find Tuan standing there, soaked and carrying the weight of desperation. The conversation between the two must have been brief and tense. There was no time to waste. They began strategizing, immediately working out how to evade the tightening noose of law enforcement. Soon one of Tuon's cousins then joined them, and together the three men exchanged ideas and devised contingency plans. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Recognizing the growing danger of harboring a fugitive, Tam decided to distance himself. Early the next morning, he packed what he could and left for Dong Nai province, leaving Tuon and his cousin to fend for themselves. However, it wasn't long before his cousin then chose to return to a relative's house in Fuho commune. Whether he was trying to establish an alibi or simply distance himself from the escalating chaos, his departure marked a shift in the fragile network around Tuon. Alone once again, Tone faced the crushing reality of his circumstances. The countryside was no longer a safe haven. Villages were under heightened surveillance, with police checkpoints and roadblocks popping up on nearly every path. Patrols combed the area relentlessly, leaving him with fewer options and no room for error. His cousin then, who was still attempting to help Tuon from afar, reached out to a local friend known for his mechanical skills and dependability. The idea was to use his friend's motorbike to get Tuon to a safer location. At first he had agreed, but the plan quickly fell apart. The getaway motorbike had broken down, rendering the escape attempt futile. Frustrated but determined, they pivoted to another idea: hiring a taxi. But during their discussions, a new obstacle presented itself. Tan had noticed that Tuon was still carrying the AK-47 rifle, the very weapon used in the murders. They all knew that transporting the rifle in one piece would be far too risky, which is why Then advised Tuon to disassemble it, hoping that doing so would reduce suspicion if they were stopped. But even with this adjustment, the plan never materialized. Communication with Tuon became increasingly sporadic, and eventually everyone involved recognized the rising danger and abandoned the plan entirely. Time was slipping away and Tuon's desperation was palpable. His sanctuary at Tam's house no longer felt secure. The once quiet countryside was now a hive of law enforcement activity, with roadblocks, helicopters, and constant patrols, leaving him with nowhere to hide. Even those who had initially supported him began to falter. The risk of aiding a fugitive weighed heavily on them. By now, it was clear that Tuon's time was running out. On February 13, 2020, nearly 2 weeks after the massacre, police received a tip that would change everything. They managed to confirm Tuon's location. He was hiding in a friend's house. The response was immediate. Over 500 personnel now from various law enforcement agencies mobilized, descending on the area in a coordinated operation. This was at the moment the manhunts had been building toward. The officers approached cautiously, knowing the danger they faced. Tuon was armed, volatile, and cornered, a lethal combination. As the task force surrounded the house, the air grew heavy with tension. Officers moved silently, their weapons drawn, their steps deliberate. Every creak of a boot on gravel and every faint rustle seemed amplified, a reminder of the danger luring within. Everyone knew what the man was capable of. After all, he had already killed for people. What were a few more lives to him? Inside the house, Tuon must have felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had evaded capture for nearly 2 weeks, but now the walls were closing in. Perhaps he listened to the faint murmurs outside, the occasional crackle of a police radio. Whatever his thoughts, he knew this was the end of the road. Cornered, armed, and desperate, to unprepared to make his last stand. For the officers outside, every second dragged like an eternity. This wasn't just an ordinary arrest. It was the culmination of a manhunt that had captivated the nation, and it could end in a bloodbath. Then it began. The stillness of the countryside shattered as Tuon opened fire, AUG-47 erupting and deafening bursts. Bullets tore through the night, splintering wood and ricocheting off surfaces. The officers returned fire with precision, their movements deliberate as they sought cover and maneuvered for position. For several minutes, the firefight raged on, with the cacophony of gunfire reverberating through the rural landscape. The flashes of light from the barrel of Tuon's rifle illuminated the scene in brief, chaotic intervals. Each burst was a grim reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just a capture, it was survival. Then, as quickly as it began, the gunfire ceased. The officers moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the lingering haze of smoke and dust. Inside the house, they found Tuan slumped against the wall, his lifeless body bearing the marks of the intense firefight. The AK-47 lay just inches from his hand, but the threat had ended. With Tuan's death, the immediate danger was neutralized, but the manhunt's conclusion left behind a wave of questions and a nation grappling with the aftermath. The massacre at the gambling den was only the beginning of a much darker revelation. As investigators sifted through evidence and conducted interviews, they uncovered a chilling web of criminal connections and intricate network of illegal arms smuggling that had enabled to violence. The AK-47 he had used wasn't just any weapon. It was part of a cache smuggled into Vietnam from neighboring Cambodia, orchestrated by a criminal syndicate deeply entrenched in the region. One name stood out: Pham Thanh Tam, the same man who had initially harbored Tuan after the massacre. Tam wasn't just an accomplice, he was a central figure in the smuggling operation. In 2018, Tam had traveled to Cambodia, where he acquired firearms, ammunition, and grenades, smuggling them back into Vietnam. Over the next year, these weapons changed hands multiple times, passing through various members of the network before finally reaching Tuan. Among them was the AK-47 with over 100 rounds of ammunition, the same rifle that turned the gambling den into a bloodbath. With Tuan's death, law enforcement shifted their focus to dismantling the network. Raids were conducted, arrests were made, and a clearer picture began to emerge of the criminal infrastructure that had armed him. The fallout from Tuan's rampage extended far beyond the immediate victims. The families of those killed at the gambling den were left to mourn their devastating losses, while the survivors grappled with the trauma of that fateful day. The broader investigation exposed the cracks in Vietnam's enforcement against illegal gambling and arms smuggling. Public outcry demanded answers. How could someone like Tuan, a former police officer, have access to such deadly firepower, and how had the criminal networks flourished unchecked for so long? As the dust settled, the legal system began addressing those who had aided Tuan. Among them, Pham Thanh Tam faced charges of aiding and abetting along with several others connected to the smuggling ring. For Vietnam, the saga of Tuan was more than the tale of a gambler turned killer. It was a painful reminder of the desperate measures a person could resort to when consumed by pride, loss, and the illusion that violence could reclaim what fate had taken away. The countryside of Cu Chi eventually returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of that January evening would linger for years to come. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.